It is the summer of 1572 AD. Moscow is still scarred. The charred timbers of an entire city have barely cooled. 1 year earlier, the most devastating raid in Russian memory turned the capital of the Tsardom into a furnace. Tens of thousands were dead. Tens of thousands more were enslaved. The Tsar himself had fled in panic. And now the Horde was coming back. Perhaps as many as 120,000 people moved in the total host. Warriors, cavalry, support troops and camp followers, with a smaller but formidable combat corps at its heart. Their leader, Devlet I Gulyay, Khan of Crimea, was no simple raider. He was backed by the full weight of the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful state on earth, and was determined to force Muscovy into permanent submission, to recover the Volga Khanates Ivan had taken, and to end Russia as an independent military power. Even the Terrible knew it. His advisors knew it. Russia had almost nothing left to stop them. The Livonian War had bled the army dry. The Oprichnina, his own internal terror purge, had gutted the nobility. The southern defences were a shadow of what they had been. By any reasonable calculation, Russia was finished. But 50 kilometres south of Moscow, in a forgotten bend of the Lapasnya River, near a tiny village called Molodi, something extraordinary was waiting for that horde. Not just an army, a trap, a machine of destruction unlike anything the steppe warriors had ever faced. A moving fortress, walls on wheels bristling with cannon and arquebus fire, commanded by a man history has almost entirely forgotten, Prince Mikhail Vorotynsky. What happened between July 29th and August 2nd, 1572, AD was one of the most decisive battles in Russian and Eastern European history. A battle that saved Russia from annihilation. A battle that delivered the Crimean Tatar horde its most damaging defeat in a generation. And a battle that almost nobody talks about. This is the brutal truth of the Battle of Molodi. Before we go any further, I made a free War Room map pack for viewers of this channel. 10 battles that changed history. Download it instantly from the link in the description or pinned comment below. Let's get into it. By 1572 AD, Russia was in trouble. Real, existential trouble. Not the kind of trouble that diplomats talk their way out of. Not the kind that better harvests fix. The kind where a nation looks at what is left of its army, its burned capital, and its terrified Tsar, and quietly begins to wonder whether it will exist in 5 years. That is the Russia that faced the Horde at Molodi. Even the fourth, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, had ruled the Tsardom of Muscovy since 1547 AD. In his earlier years, he had shown genuine brilliance. He reformed the army, he modernized the legal code, and he struck east with devastating force, capturing the Khanate of Kazan in 1552 AD and the Khanate of Astrakhan in 1556 AD, pushing the borders of Russia deeper into former Mongol territory than any Russian ruler before him. These were stunning victories, and they sent a clear message to the steppe powers. Russia was no longer prey, but then Ivan turned inward, and everything began to unravel. The Livonian War, launched in 1558 AD to seize access to the Baltic Sea, became a grinding, catastrophic drain on Russian manpower and treasury. Worse, Ivan's paranoia unleashed the Oprichnina in 1565 AD, a state within a state, a black-robed secret police force that terrorized, executed, and dismembered the Russian noble class. The very military commanders Russia needed most were purged, exiled, or killed. The southern border defences, the chain of frontier fortresses and cavalry patrols that had kept the Crimean Tatars at bay, were left critically undermanned. Devlet I Gulyay had been watching all of this. The Khan of Crimea was a shrewd and patient man. A vassal of the Ottoman Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent and his successors, Devlet had raided Russia repeatedly throughout the 1550s and 1560s AD, probing, bleeding, and testing. But in May 1571 AD, he struck with his full force. He found the Oka River line barely defended. He bypassed the Russian army entirely, and on the 24th of May, 1571 AD, his horsemen swept into the suburbs of Moscow itself and set them ablaze. The fire spread with horrifying speed. Contemporary accounts describe the wind carrying flames across the wooden city in less than 3 hours. The streets became killing grounds, choked with smoke and stampeding crowds. Tens of thousands of Muscovites died, crushed, burned, or asphyxiated. The English ambassador's own residence was consumed in the inferno. Gulyay-gorod reportedly sat on a hill outside the city and watched Moscow burn. When his riders rode back south, they took with them an estimated 100,000 Russian captives to be sold into the slave markets of Crimea and Constantinople. It was the single worst military disaster in Russian history since the Mongol invasion of 1237 AD. Even the Terrible, who had fled the city before the attack, was shattered. He wrote desperate letters to foreign courts. He considered fleeing to England. The Oprichnina, his great instrument of terror, was quietly disbanded. It had failed at the one thing an army must do: protect the nation. By the spring of 1572 AD, even faced a simple, brutal reality. Gulyay-gorod was coming back, this time not just to raid, but to conquer. And the only thing standing between the Tatar horde and the complete destruction of the Russian state was one general, one desperate plan, and one extraordinary machine of war. To understand what descended on Russia in the summer of 1572 AD, you first need to understand where it came from. Not just the military force, not just the numbers, but the centuries of history, trauma, and unfinished business between the Russian people and the horsemen of the steppe. Because the army that crossed the Oka River that July was not a random raid. It was the culmination of something far older and far more terrifying. It was the steppe coming to collect a debt it believed Russia still owed. For over 200 years, from 1237 AD to the late 1400s AD, the lands of Rus had lived under Mongol domination. The Golden Horde, the western branch of the great Mongol Empire built by Genghis Khan, had swept into the Russian principalities like a force of nature. City after city fell. Vladimir was burned. Ryazan was destroyed so completely it was never rebuilt on the same site. Kiev, once the crown jewel of Slavic civilization, was reduced to a field of bones. Contemporaries described rivers running red, roads lined with skulls, entire provinces emptied of their populations. The Mongols did not just conquer Russia, they consumed it. The princes of Rus became tributaries, vassals who bent the knee, who travelled in submission to the Mongol court, who collected taxes for their overlords and delivered them on their knees. For generation after generation, Russian children grew up in a world where the steppe was the source of all authority, all fear and all destruction. The word Tatar, a name used interchangeably for these steppe peoples, became synonymous in the Russian language with catastrophe itself. To call something a Tatar raid was to invoke the end of everything familiar. The grip of the Golden Horde began to fracture in the 14th century AD and collapsed definitively in the 15th. But the disappearance of a single empire did not end the threat. It fractured it, and in many ways that made things worse. The remnants of the Golden Horde splintered into a series of successor Khanates, each one a military power in its own right. There was the Khanate of Kazan, sitting on the Volga River to Russia's east, the Khanate of Astrakhan further south on the Volga's mouth, the Great Horde on the open steppe, and most dangerous of all, the Khanate of Crimea, the fortified peninsula jutting into the Black Sea, protected by its geography, supplied by the wealth of the Ottoman slave trade, and backed by the full military and financial power of the Ottoman Empire. The Crimean Khanate was not like the others. Its Khans were not merely independent warlords. From 1475 AD onward, Crimea was formerly a vassal state of the Ottoman Empire, the most powerful empire on earth at the height of its power. The Ottoman Sultan provided the Crimean Khans with military support, diplomatic protection, and a guaranteed buyer for the most profitable commodity on the steppe: human beings. The slave trade was the lifeblood of Crimean power. Every raid into Russian, Polish, or Lithuanian territory produced thousands of captives who were marched south and sold at the great slave markets of Kaffa, a port city on the Crimean coast that historians estimate processed well over 1 million slaves between the 15th and 17th centuries AD. Russia's people were literally being harvested. Ivan the Terrible was not naive about this. When he came to power in 1547 AD, he understood clearly that Muscovy faced a fundamental strategic problem. It was surrounded. To the west, the Livonian Order and then the kingdoms of Sweden and Poland-Lithuania contested Russia's access to the Baltic Sea. To the north, the White Sea offered a trade route to England but little strategic depth. To the east, the Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan blocked Russia's expansion and periodically raided its eastern borders, and to the south, the Crimean Khanate conducted near-annual raids into the Russian heartland, burning, killing, and enslaving with near-total impunity. Ivan's response in his earlier and more capable years was to go east first. In 1552 AD, in a campaign that stunned the Islamic world, he led a Russian army equipped with artillery against the heavily fortified city of Kazan and took it by storm. He had engineers tunnel beneath the walls and pack the tunnels with gunpowder. The resulting explosion breached the defences and allowed his troops to pour through. Kazan fell. The Khanate was absorbed into Muscovy. 4 years later, in 1556 AD, Astrakhan fell as well, with barely a fight. Suddenly, the entire length of the Volga River, the great highway of the East, was in Russian hands. These victories were genuinely transformative. They removed the threat from the east and opened the door to the vast resources of the Urals and Siberia. They gave Ivan tremendous prestige, both at home and abroad. The Orthodox Church celebrated him as a Crusader Tsar, the hammer of the infidel. Diplomatic missions arrived from England, from the Holy Roman Empire, from Persia. Ivan was, for a brief brilliant moment, one of the most consequential rulers in the world. But Kazan and Astrakhan were not just Russian victories, they were Ottoman humiliations. Both Khanates were Muslim states with Ottoman connections. Their fall stripped the Sultan of allies on the Volga and threatened Ottoman control of the Black Sea's northern hinterland. The Ottomans responded first through diplomacy, then through proxy. The Crimean Khan Devlet I Gulyay, who had himself lobbied for an Ottoman military expedition to retake Astrakhan in 1569 AD, became the instrument of Ottoman revenge. That expedition, launched overland through the steppe, was a catastrophic failure, destroyed by logistics, weather, and Russian resistance at Astrakhan's walls. But Devlet Gulyay was not finished. He simply changed his strategy. He would not go for Astrakhan, he would go for the heart. By the late 1560s AD, Ivan's Russia was in serious trouble. The Livonian War, now in its second decade, was consuming men and money at a terrifying rate. The Russian army that had stormed Kazan with such discipline and firepower was being ground down in the Baltic forests and marshes. Worse, Ivan's mental state had begun its catastrophic deterioration. The death of his first wife Anastasia in 1560 AD, which Ivan was convinced was a poisoning orchestrated by the boyar nobility, triggered a descent into paranoia that would define the rest of his reign. The result was the Oprichnina. Established in 1565 AD, the Oprichnina was one of the most extraordinary and destructive acts of self-sabotage in the history of any state at war. Ivan literally divided Russia in two. One half, the Zemshchina, remained the normal territory of the state, administered by the regular government and boyar class. The other half, the Oprichnina, became Ivan's personal domain, administered by his personal army of black-robed horsemen, the Oprichniki, who rode with a dog's head and broom tied to their saddles to symbolize their role as the Tsar's hounds, sniffing out treachery and sweeping it away. In practice, the Oprichniki became a state-sponsored instrument of terror. They descended on the estates of noble families, accused them of treason on the flimsiest of pretexts, and slaughtered entire households. Their most notorious act came in 1570 AD, just 1 year before the Moscow fire, when Ivan unleashed them on Novgorod, Russia's second greatest city, in a campaign of mass murder that lasted for weeks and killed thousands of innocent civilians. The military consequences of the Oprichnina were devastating. Russia's noble cavalry class, the Pomesty horsemen who formed the backbone of the field army, had been decimated by paranoia, exile, and execution. The commanders who knew how to fight the Tatars, who understood the steppe, who had spent careers learning the rhythms of nomadic warfare, were dead or had fled to Lithuania. When Devlet Gulyay came north in May 1571 AD, the southern border defences had been stripped by the Oprichnina's political purges. The watchtower network along the Oka River, the critical early warning system that was supposed to detect and slow any Tatar advance, was undermanned and poorly coordinated. Gulyay-gorod had been raiding Russia since the early 1550s AD. He knew the terrain. He had spies. And in 1571 AD, he had something he had never had before: detailed intelligence about the collapse of Russian defences. He chose his route carefully, bypassing the strongest sections of the Oka line and finding a crossing point that was barely guarded. The Russian commander on the Oka, reportedly paralysed by the Oprichniki political purges within the officer class, failed to concentrate enough force to stop the crossing in time. The Tatar Horde, an estimated 40,000 fighting cavalry by most scholarly accounts, with a larger total force when support troops and allied contingents are counted, swept north toward Moscow almost unopposed. The Russian army scrambled to shadow them, but could not get ahead of the advance. When the Tatars reached the outskirts of Moscow, some Russian forces had managed to position themselves between the city and the Horde, fighting desperate rearguard actions in the suburbs, but they were too few and too late. The fire that engulfed Moscow in May 1571 AD is believed to have been started by the Tatars igniting the suburban wooden settlements, and the wind did the rest. Contemporary sources, including the account of German adventurer Heinrich von Staden, who was present in Russia at the time, describe a catastrophe of almost incomprehensible scale. The fire consumed the city in hours. The wooden streets and densely packed houses became a single enormous furnace. People fled to the river and drowned in the crush. Others suffocated in cellars where they had hidden. The Metropolitan Kirill, head of the Russian Orthodox Church Bias, was nearly killed himself, pulled barely alive from the rubble. English merchant accounts described smoke visible for dozens of miles. The stone Kremlin survived, but everything around it was ash. Russian chronicles record that the streets were so choked with corpses that teams spent weeks clearing bodies from the city and the river. Estimates of the dead range into the tens of thousands, and Gulyay-gorod's riders, when they rode south, took with them somewhere between 60,000 and 100,000 Russian men, women and children in chains, a number consistent with the scale of the slave markets at Kaffa, which saw enormous increases in Russian slave intake in the years following 1571 AD. Ivan the Terrible's response to the Moscow catastrophe was deeply revealing of his psychological state. He did not rally his forces and prepare an immediate counterattack. He did not appear publicly to inspire his people. He negotiated. He sent messengers to Gulyay-gorod offering extraordinary concessions, including the possibility of returning Astrakhan, the jewel of his early conquests, in exchange for peace. Gulyay-gorod's response was dismissive. He sent back a contemptuous message demanding not just Astrakhan but Kazan as well, plus enormous annual tribute payments, in effect demanding that Russia return to the subordinate status it had suffered under the Golden Horde for 200 years. Ivan appears to have been genuinely shattered by the 1571 disaster. The sources from this period show a man lurching between terror and grandiose defiance. He quietly disbanded the Oprichnina in 1572 AD. The organisation he had used as his primary instrument of power for 7 years was simply dissolved, its very name banned from official use, as if acknowledging its existence was too embarrassing. He transported the Russian state treasury northward to Novgorod and Vologda, apparently preparing for the possibility that Moscow would fall permanently. Some accounts suggest he even contemplated seeking exile in England, having previously opened negotiations with Queen Elizabeth I about the possibility of mutual asylum in case either ruler was overthrown. But Ivan also did one thing right. In the winter of 1571 to 1572 AD, as he was preparing for the near-certain return of the Tatar Horde, he appointed Prince Mikhail Ivanovich Vorotynsky as supreme commander of Russia's southern defences. It was one of the most consequential military appointments in Russian history, and given what Ivan would later do to Vorotynsky, perhaps one of the most tragic. Mikhail Vorotynsky was everything the Oprichnina had tried to destroy. He was old Russian nobility. His family had served the Muscovite princes for generations. He was experienced, capable, and deeply familiar with steppe warfare. He had commanded Russian forces against the Tatars before, and understood their tactics instinctively. He also had a personal history with Ivan that was complicated and dangerous. He had previously been arrested on suspicion of treason, subjected to years of disgrace, and only recently restored to favour. He knew, perhaps more clearly than anyone, that the margin for error was zero. If he failed to stop the Horde in 1572 AD, Russia was finished. And given Ivan's nature, if he won but made a political enemy, he was finished anyway. Vorotynsky spent the winter and spring of 1572 AD preparing his defence with methodical, impressive thoroughness. He drafted a comprehensive new border defence, Statute, the Boyar Duma's formal military regulation for the southern frontier, which laid out in detail the placement of watchtower forces, the coordination of cavalry patrols, and the chain of command along the entire Oka line. He assembled what forces he could, roughly 20,000 to 25,000 fighting men in total, a force dwarfed by what was coming but composed of quality soldiers. The Great Regiment, the core of the force, numbered around 8,255 men. The regiment of the right hand counted 3,590. The left-hand regiment had 1,651. The advance regiment contained 4,475. The Watchtower regiment added another 4,670. There were also Don Cossacks, free riders from the southern steppe who knew the land intimately. And there was a small company of Narva-based mercenary pistoliers, foreign professionals who added specialist cavalry firepower to the Russian force. Together, they represented almost everything Russia had left in the field. Devlet-Giray, meanwhile, had spent the winter building the largest invasion force he had ever assembled. He'd gone to Constantinople and secured the Sultan's full backing. He had gathered not just the Crimean cavalry, but large contingents from the Nogai Horde, another steppe confederation, as well as Ottoman janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, and Ottoman artillery. Various sources give figures ranging from 60,000 to 120,000 total warriors, with a full force including camp followers and support personnel, likely putting the total number well over 100,000 people moving across the steppe. The hard military corps, the actual fighting cavalry and infantry, was estimated by Russian military historians at between 60,000 and 80,000 combatants, an enormous force by any 16th century AD standard. Devlet-Giray was supremely confident. He had destroyed Moscow with a fraction of this force the year before. The Russian army had failed to stop him then. He expected the same result now. He's recorded as having told the Ottoman Sultan that he would conquer the whole of the Russian land within a single year, return to Crimea with Ivan the Terrible in chains, and distribute Russian lands among his nobles. These were not idle boasts for political theatre. They reflect a genuine assessment of Russian weakness that was, by the numbers and the evidence of 1571 AD, entirely reasonable. By late July 1572 AD, the Tatar vanguard had reached the Oka River, the great river that had served as Russia's last natural defensive barrier south of Moscow had been breached. The Horde moved north along the Serpukhov Road, the direct route to Moscow. Devlet-Giray expected to be in the Russian capital within days. He expected to find a broken, starving, disorganized enemy that would crumble before his cavalry the way it had crumbled 12 months ago. What he did not know, what none of his scouts had adequately reported, was that Vorotynsky was not trying to hold the river line. He was drawing the Horde forward. He was letting them come north, stretching their supply lines across miles of open steppe, separating their vanguard from their rear, bringing them toward a specific place, at a specific time, where a specific weapon was waiting. A weapon unlike anything the steppe had ever seen. A fortress that moved, a wall of fire on wheels, and behind its oak planks and gun ports, 20,000 men who had nothing left to lose. Every army that has ever marched to war has carried with it a theory of how battles are won. For the Crimean Tatars and the nomadic horsemen of the Eurasian steppe, that theory had been refined over centuries, battle-tested across thousands of miles, and proven so devastatingly effective that it had brought down empires, shattered kingdoms, and reduced one of the oldest civilizations in the world to rubble and bondage. Their theory was simple, elegant, and nearly impossible to defeat by conventional means: speed, fluidity, and the avoidance of fixed engagement. You do not stand and fight. You move, you strike, you disappear. And when the enemy chases you, you turn and destroy him. Understanding that theory, truly understanding it at a deep mechanical level, is what made Vorotynsky's solution so extraordinary. Because to defeat the steppe horsemen, you could not try to outride them, outmaneuver them, or chase them across open ground. You had to remove the one advantage that made them invincible. You had to take away the open field. You had to bring the wall to them. The steppe nomad's system of war had not changed in its fundamentals since the time of the ancient Scythians. A skilled horse archer riding at full gallop could loose a volley of arrows and wheel away before the enemy could close the distance. Repeat that process 10,000 times across a single day's battle, and you could destroy an army 3 times your size without ever bringing your men into the zone where the enemy's weapons could kill them. The horse archer's ideal battlefield was the open steppe, flat, featureless, offering unlimited space to maneuver, impossible terrain for infantry to hold any defensive line. The worst nightmare of the steppe cavalry was a battlefield that negated their mobility. Marshes, forests, mountain passes, and walls. Walls that could move. The concept behind the Gulyay-gorod, which translates roughly from Russian as rolling city or walking city, was not entirely new in 1572 AD. The idea of a mobile fortification built from wagons or prefabricated wooden panels had appeared in different forms in different cultures. The Hussite warriors of Bohemia in the early 15th century AD had pioneered the wagon fort, known as the Wagenburg, a circle of chained battle wagons from which crossbowmen and early handgunners could pour devastating fire into attacking cavalry. The Hussites used this system with remarkable effectiveness against larger crusading armies, repelling multiple invasions. The Ottoman Turks had used similar methods, the Persians before them. The concept of the fortified wagon as a battlefield solution to cavalry dominance was ancient and widespread. But the Russian Gulyay-gorod of the 16th century AD was something distinctly different, and specifically engineered for the conditions of the Eurasian steppe. It was not simply a circle of wagons. It was a modular, prefabricated, purpose-built mobile fortification system, essentially a portable wooden fortress that could be assembled, reconfigured, extended and moved across open ground. The Russian military establishment had been developing and refining the system since at least the 1530s AD during the Russo-Kazan Wars, and by 1572 AD it had been brought to a level of sophistication that contemporary observers found genuinely astonishing. The basic component of the Gulyay-gorod was the large wooden panel, a shield wall section roughly the height of a standing man, and wide enough that several soldiers could shelter behind it. These panels were constructed from heavy oak timbers, thick enough to stop an arrow and substantially resistant to small-caliber firearms. Each panel was fitted with gun ports, carefully cut apertures positioned at the right height and angle for a soldier inside to aim and fire an arquebus, a pistol, or a light cannon without exposing any part of his body to return fire. The gun ports were typically fitted with wooden covers or flaps that could be dropped down between shots, both to protect the gunner during reloading and to prevent the enemy from firing back through the opening, during the critical period when the weapon was being prepared. Each panel was mounted on either wheels or sleds, wheels for dry ground summer deployment, sleds for winter operations or soft ground movement. This mounting allowed the panels to be pushed, pulled or dragged across the battlefield by soldiers working from the protected side, reconfiguring the fortress in real time as tactical conditions changed. Teams of men working in coordinated groups could extend the wall in a new direction, close a gap, or pull back a section to create an opening for cavalry to charge out and return through, a feature of enormous tactical importance, as it allowed the Gulyay-gorod to function not just as a passive defensive position, but as a launch pad for offensive action. The scale at which the Gulyay-gorod was deployed at Molodi in 1572 AD was unprecedented in Russian military history. The fortress assembled for this campaign was not a small perimeter or a company-scale defensive ring. It was a military installation large enough to shelter and sustain an army in the field for multiple days of sustained combat. Russian sources describe a structure that in its deployed configuration stretched for considerable distances, a linear or semi-enclosed formation of connected panels, each gap filled and each corner reinforced, creating what amounted to a continuous wall of oak and iron that could stretch for hundreds of meters. The total number of panels and wagons involved in the Molodi Gulyay-gorod is not precisely recorded in surviving sources, but based on the size of the force it sheltered, approximately 20,000 men, it was clearly a massive structure requiring significant logistical preparation and transport. The weapons behind those oak walls were a critical part of what made the system so devastatingly lethal. Russia's military modernization under Ivan the Terrible had placed heavy emphasis on firearms, both personal weapons and artillery, as primary instruments of battlefield destruction. The streltsy, Russia's professional musketeer infantry, had been created by Ivan IV sometime between 1545 and 1550 AD as a standing force of trained, uniformed, regularly paid soldiers armed with the pishchal, the Russian arquebus. These men were not conscripted peasants handed a weapon and pushed toward the enemy. They were career soldiers who drilled regularly with their weapons, who understood the mechanics of matchlock ignition, powder charges, and volley fire, and who had developed the disciplined muscle memory necessary to reload and fire effectively under the enormous stress of combat. The streltsy were issued the pistol matchlock arquebus as their primary weapon, a smoothbore muzzle-loading firearm that projected a lead ball with enough force to kill a man or horse at ranges of up to 50 to 100 meters depending on conditions, and to wound at considerably greater distances. For close-in work they also carried the bardiche, a uniquely Russian weapon that combined elements of the battle axe and the polearm into a large curved blade on a long shaft. The bardiche served a double duty, as a hand-to-hand weapon for the inevitable moments when the enemy broke through the gaps in the wall, and as a shooting rest for the arquebus, its long shaft planted in the ground to steady the barrel during the slow, careful process of aiming and firing. This combination, mobile fortress, trained musketeer, stabilized shooting platform, created a system of firepower density behind the wooden walls that was genuinely extraordinary for its era. But the streltsy's personal weapons were only half the story. The Gulyay-gorod's real killing power came from its artillery. Russian armies of the mid-16th century AD had developed a substantial tradition of field artillery use, driven in large part by the need to reduce the fortifications of the eastern Khanates during the campaigns against Kazan and Astrakhan. The cannon deployed behind the Gulyay-gorod's walls at Molodi ranged from light swivel-mounted pieces, rapid-firing small-caliber guns that could be quickly aimed and discharged through the gun ports, to heavier field guns capable of hurling iron and stone shot through formations of cavalry at ranges of several hundred meters. The lighter pieces in particular were ideally suited to the role of anti-cavalry weapons. Loaded with case shot, a tin or leather container packed with small iron balls, lead pellets, or scraps of metal, a single cannon discharge at close range could tear through a mass of advancing horsemen like a scythe through wheat. The positioning of the artillery within the Gulyay-gorod was deliberate and systematic. The heavier pieces were sighted to provide long-range fires that could begin killing enemy cavalry while they were still forming up for their charges, disrupting their organization and forcing them to begin their attack already taking casualties. The lighter, faster-firing pieces were concentrated at the points most likely to be targeted by the main Tatar assault formations, where the volume of close-range fire would be most devastating. And between the artillery pieces, packed into every available space behind the oak panels, stood the streltsy with their arquebuses, a layered, mutually supporting system of firepower that meant there was almost no angle or range from which an attacker could approach the Gulyay-gorod without entering a zone of lethal fire. Vorotynsky's plan for the deployment of this weapon system at Molodi was a masterpiece of terrain exploitation and psychological manipulation. He did not simply set up the Gulyay-gorod in an open field and wait to be attacked. He chose his ground with extreme care, positioning the mobile fortress on terrain that channeled the Tatar cavalry into specific approach corridors, reduced their ability to exploit their numerical advantage through flanking movements, and maximized the killing effect of the Russian firepower. The village of Molodi sat near the Lopasnya River, a tributary of the Oka. The river and the surrounding landscape of mixed forest and open ground created natural choke points that forced attacking cavalry to bunch together and approach from limited directions, exactly the conditions under which massed firearms fire was most lethal. But the Gulyay-gorod alone, however well positioned, could not win the battle by itself. A static defensive position, however powerful, can always be bypassed or contained and left to wither. Vorotynsky understood this. His plan incorporated the Gulyay-gorod not as the sole element of the defence, but as the anchor of a combined arms system that used every type of force available to him in a carefully coordinated sequence. The Cossack cavalry and the mobile horse regiments would operate outside the walls, screening the fortress, provoking the Tatars, and retreating back through the Gulyay-gorod's deliberately opened gates, dragging the pursuing enemy cavalry directly into the killing ground in front of the gun ports. This was the fire ambush technique that Russian commanders had been developing for years. Use your mobile cavalry as bait, pull the enemy forward at the run with their blood up and their formation broken, and then let the oak walls and the cannon end the pursuit with a wall of fire at point-blank range. The key operational commander executing this role was Prince Dmitry Ivanovich Kvorostinin, a brilliant, aggressive cavalry commander who had become one of the forgotten heroes of Russian military history. Kvorostinin commanded the advance regiment, the forward cavalry screen that was assigned the most dangerous and psychologically demanding task in the Russian plan. Making contact with the advancing Tatar horde, fighting them hard enough to inflame their pursuit instinct, and then withdrawing in a controlled manner that was indistinguishable from a genuine rout. This was extraordinarily difficult to execute. Too slow, and the Tatars would suspect a trap and pull back. Too fast, and the formation would actually break and turn into a real rout, with the cavalry cut down piecemeal before reaching the Gulyay-gorod's gates. The retreat had to look desperate while being completely controlled. It required iron discipline, exceptional horsemanship, and absolute trust in the fortress waiting at the other end of the withdrawal. There was another element of the Russian plan that demonstrated just how sophisticated Vorotynsky's operational thinking had become. He did not intend to remain purely on the defensive throughout the battle. The Gulyay-gorod was not his endgame, it was his anvil. While the Tatar horde broke itself against the wooden walls, Vorotynsky planned to use his cavalry forces operating outside the fortress to gather intelligence on the enemy's movements, identify the moment when the Tatar force had committed its reserves to the assault, and then, at precisely the right instant, launch a devastating counterattack from outside the fortress walls that would hit the enemy in the flank or rear while the Gulyay-gorod held them fixed in place from the front. The fortress would be the anvil that fixed the enemy. The cavalry would be the hammer that crushed him. Vorotynsky had one other, crucial advantage that is easy to overlook in accounts focused on the drama of the battle itself: intelligence. The Russian border patrol system, the watchtower network and cavalry screen along the Oka, had been substantially rebuilt after the catastrophe of 1571 AD. The new border defence statute that Vorotynsky himself had drafted specified precise arrangements for scouting patrols extending deep into the steppe, designed to provide maximum advance warning of any Tatar advance. By the time Devlet-Giray's horde crossed the Oka in late July 1572 AD, Vorotynsky knew they were coming. He knew their route. He had time to position his forces and complete the assembly of the Gulyay-gorod before the Tatar vanguard made contact. This was not a desperate last-minute improvisation. This was a premeditated killing ground, carefully prepared and deliberately baited. It is worth pausing here to contemplate what this weapon system represented in the broader context of 16th century AD military history. Europe in 1572. AD was in the middle of its own military revolution, the gradual grinding process by which gunpowder weapons were transforming the nature of warfare on every level, from individual tactics to strategic doctrine. The Spanish tercios, those legendary formations of pike and shot infantry, were demonstrating in the Netherlands and Italy that disciplined firearms could defeat cavalry, and that well-organised foot soldiers could anchor a battlefield in ways that had been impossible before gunpowder. The same lesson was being learned across Europe, in different forms by different armies. But Russia's solution to the same problem, the problem of how to protect and deploy firearms on a battlefield dominated by mobile cavalry, was distinctly Russian. The Gulyay-gorod was not the tercio. It did not rely on deep formations of pikemen protecting vulnerable musketeers. It relied on wood and engineering. It put the wall between the gunner and the horseman and let the physics of the situation do the rest. In a steppe environment, where there were no trees to shelter behind, no city walls to shelter within, no fortifications to fall back on, this portable wooden fortress was not just a clever tactical innovation, it was an existential necessity. Without it, Russian firearms could never be concentrated and protected long enough to produce decisive results against the mobile, fast-moving cavalry of the steppe. The assembly of the Gulyay-gorod for the Molodi campaign was itself a significant logistical undertaking. The panels had to be cut and shaped at workshops in Moscow or other cities, loaded onto carts, and transported south along the road network toward the likely battle area. Teams of carpenters and engineers travelled with the army, responsible for rapid assembly and repair under field conditions. The horses and oxen needed to haul the structure, the extra axles and wheels kept in reserve for battle damage, the stocks of powder, shot, and arquebus ammunition that had to be pre-positioned inside the walls. All of this required planning and organisation weeks and months ahead of the battle itself. This was not the improvised desperation of a cornered nation throwing up any barrier it could find. This was deliberate, professional military engineering. When the Tatar vanguard first made contact with Russian forces near Serpukhov in late July of 1572 AD and began pushing north toward Moscow, the Gulyay-gorod was already in position south of the capital. Vorotynsky had placed it on ground he had chosen, oriented and anchored to the terrain, with its gun ports covering the most likely approach routes. The fortress was not visible to the main Tatar force from a distance. The folded terrain, the river, and the light woodland screening the position meant that the Horde would not fully understand what they were advancing toward until they were already committed. On July 29, 1572 AD, Prince Kvorostyn's advance regiment made first major contact with the Tatar force near the Lopasnya River. What followed over the next days was a battle that would test the Gulyay-gorod system to its absolute limits, and would prove, beyond any doubt, that Vorotynsky's gamble had been correct. The oak walls would hold, the cannon would fire, and the steppe would run red. Before we get to the bloodbath at Molodi, a quick word. This channel exists because people like you watch, share, and support it. One of the easiest ways to support wars in history at no extra cost to yourself is to use NordVPN. We use it, we trust it, and if you grab a subscription through our link in the description, a portion goes directly to keeping this channel alive and producing stories like this one. NordVPN keeps your connection secure and private. Whether you're researching history, streaming, or just browsing, the link is in the description below. It genuinely helps us. Now, back to the slaughter. July 26th, 1572 AD. The Russian sentries on the watchtower line south of the Oka River saw the dust cloud first. Then came the sound, a low rolling din building steadily from the south. Then, through the summer haze, the vast dark shape of the advancing host itself stretching wide across the steppe, filling the horizon as far as a man could see in either direction. The horde that Devlet I had assembled was the largest offensive force ever launched by the Crimean Khanate against Muscovy. Contemporary Russian chronicles, the Novgorod Second Chronicle and the Moscow Chronicle, record figures of 120,000 and 150,000 respectively. Modern Russian historians, working from the logistical realities of steppe campaigning and comparative source analysis, generally estimate the combat effective core of the Tatar force at between 40,000 and 60,000 fighting men, with the total column including support personnel, slaves and slave handlers, camp followers, and baggage considerably larger. Whatever the precise figure, the force was enormous, large enough that it could not cross the Oka River at a single point simultaneously, large enough that its passage disrupted the local environment for miles around, and large enough that its commander had every reason to believe no force in Russia could stop it in open battle. On July 26, 1572 AD, the Horde's vanguard reached the Oka River near Serpukhov, where the main Russian defensive line was positioned. The crossing of the Oka was the first critical phase of the campaign. The river was a natural obstacle, and Russian forces holding the northern bank with fortified positions and artillery had historically been able to slow or prevent Tatar crossings long enough to concentrate their field army. In 1572 AD, Vorotynsky had deployed strong forces at the main crossing points. The Horde's initial attempt to force a crossing at Serpukhov was met with Russian defensive fire that inflicted casualties and temporarily halted the advance. But Devlet had no intention of forcing a frontal crossing at the defended point. He was a veteran campaigner, and he understood the Oka line as well as any Russian commander. His scouts, who had been ranging ahead of the main body for days, had identified a crossing point at Senkin Ford near Kashira, east of the main Russian position, where the defences were comparatively weak. On the night of July 27th, 1572 AD, the bulk of the Tatar force slipped quietly eastward along the southern bank of the Oka and made their crossing at Kashira, bypassing the Russian main line entirely. A token Russian force at the crossing, reportedly numbering only around 200 men according to chronicles, was overwhelmed and scattered. By dawn on July 28th, Devlet-Juray's horde was across the Oka and moving north toward Moscow, with the Russian main army scrambling on its eastern flank to intercept. This was the nightmare scenario. The Oka line had been turned. The road to Moscow was open, and Devlet-Juray, riding north at the head of his cavalry, had every reason to believe 1572 AD was going to be a repeat of 1571 AD. He sent forward his best commander, Divy Mirza, also recorded as Divy Mirza, one of the most senior Nogai commanders in the Tatar force, and a man considered indispensable to Devlet-Juray's campaign. Divy Mirza's assignment was to push north as fast as possible, screen the main force, and deal with any Russian interference. He was given the largest and most mobile portion of the Tatar cavalry, and sent ahead with a simple order: get to Moscow. What Divy Mirza found instead was Prince Dmitry Khvorostinin and the Russian advance regiment, already positioned and waiting near the Lopasnya River. The initial clash on July 29th, 1572 AD was fierce and deliberate. Khvorostinin was not trying to stop the Tatar advance guard in a pitched engagement. He did not have the numbers for that, and stopping them was not the plan. He was trying to provoke. He needed Divy Mirza to see the Russian cavalry, engage them, and chase them. He needed the Tatar commanders to commit their forward forces to a pursuit. And he needed to do all of this while withdrawing at a pace that was fast enough to stay ahead of the Tatar horsemen, but slow enough to keep the pursuers interested. Based on the sequence of events described in Russian chronicles, the engagement unfolded roughly as Vorotynsky had intended. Khvorostinin's cavalry made sharp contact, inflicted casualties, and then conducted a withdrawal toward the Gulyay-gorod's position. The Tatar vanguard pressed the pursuit hard. They came around a curve in the terrain near the village of Molodi, pushed through the light woodland edge, and had their first full view of what was waiting for them. The Gulyay-gorod stood on a rise of ground between the Lopasnya River and the surrounding woodland, its oak panels forming a continuous wall that ran for hundreds of meters, its gun ports dark and closed in the summer morning light. And then the gun ports opened. The first volley of the Battle of Molodi erupted from behind those wooden walls at a range of less than 100 meters. Russian chronicles describe the sound as a continuous thunder that rolled across the river valley. The Tatar vanguard, charging at full speed directly into the killing ground, took the full impact of massed arquebus and cannon fire at point-blank range. The effect on cavalry at close range of disciplined firearms volley fire combined with artillery discharging case shot is not pleasant to describe. The physics are simple and brutal. A lead ball from a matchlock arquebus at under 50 meters penetrates horse armor, horse flesh, and human bone with equal indifference. Case shot from a light field piece, a tin container packed with iron balls and scraps of metal, discharged at close range, was devastatingly effective against packed cavalry formations at close range. The first rank of the charging Tatar vanguard took the full impact at close range. The momentum of the charge carried the following ranks forward into the chaos ahead of them. Within moments, the assault had collapsed into a confused mass of men and horses with no room to maneuver, all within range of the gun ports already being reloaded for a second discharge. Divy Mirza had led from the front, as good cavalry commanders of the era did, and was caught in the chaos of the failed charge. In the confusion of the repulse, his horse threw him or was shot from under him, and the Nogai general was captured by Russian soldiers who sallied briefly from the Gulyay-gorod's gates to take prisoners from among the fallen. The capture of Divy Mirza, one of the most senior and capable military commanders in the entire Tatar force, was both a tactical windfall and a psychological blow to the Horde. It removed the man best qualified to rapidly adapt the Tatar assault tactics, and it demonstrated to the Tatar rank and file that whatever they had expected to find north of the Oka, this was something different. But Devlet-Juray did not recoil. He was not the kind of commander who pulled back at the first setback, and the capture of Divy Mirza, while painful, was not enough to stop a force of his size. He had the numbers. He had experienced cavalry that had smashed Russian defences before, and he had something the Russian chronicles sometimes overlook. He also had Ottoman janissaries and Ottoman artillery. The Khan ordered his full force to concentrate on the Gulyay-gorod and ordered the assault to continue. What followed over the next several days was a sustained and brutal close-range combat action. The Tatar cavalry were not cowards, and they were not tactically naive. They had encountered fixed defensive positions before and knew the general principles of dealing with them. The steppe horsemen's response to a wall was not to charge it frontally over and over with the same formation. That was suicide. The response was to probe for weaknesses, find angles of approach that were not covered by the defensive fire, use the speed and mobility of the cavalry to keep the defenders rotating and unable to concentrate their fire, and bring up heavy weapons to breach or suppress the defences. Gulyay applied all of these principles at Molodi. His cavalry probed the flanks of the Gulyay-gorod repeatedly, looking for unprotected angles or gaps in the panel line. His archers saturated the gun ports with arrow fire during the intervals between Russian volleys, trying to catch Russian soldiers in the act of reloading. His Ottoman artillery was brought up to engage the wooden walls from a distance, attempting to splinter the oak panels and create breaches through which cavalry could charge. And his infantry, including the Janissaries, among the Ottoman Empire's elite infantry, attempted on multiple occasions to close with the walls and fight their way over them in close combat. The Russian defenders met every assault. The Gulyay-gorod's design had anticipated most of these approaches. The gun ports with their wooden covers could be snapped shut between shots, protecting the loader from arrow fire. The thickness of the oak panels resisted all but the heaviest artillery at the ranges from which the Tatar guns were deployed. The interlocking fields of fire created by the staggered panel arrangement meant that there were very few true dead ground zones where an attacker could shelter without being engaged by fire from multiple directions simultaneously. And behind the walls, the Streltsy maintained their discipline with the grim professionalism that Ivan's military reforms had produced, loading, presenting, firing, and reloading in rotation, keeping up a sustained volume of fire that denied the attackers any moment of respite in which to exploit a gap or organise a decisive rush. The days that followed the initial engagement on July 29th, 1572 AD were a grinding, continuous ordeal for both sides. The Tatar cavalry returned to the assault again and again, sometimes in mass formations, sometimes in smaller probing groups, sometimes dismounted to try to fight their way over the walls on foot. Each assault was beaten back. The ground in front of the Gulyay-gorod accumulated bodies with each failed charge. Dead horses in particular became a feature of the battle landscape, their carcasses forming an involuntary obstacle course that slowed subsequent attacks, forced charging cavalry to pick their way through fallen animals, and broke up the formation cohesion that made a cavalry charge lethal. Some Tatar forces, in their desperation to get over the walls, actually dismounted and attempted to pull the gun port covers open with their hands, or to use ropes and grappling hooks to drag the panels apart. Russian accounts describe close-range fighting through the gun ports themselves, swords and spears thrusting through the openings as attackers tried to reach the defenders, and defenders tried to clear the men clustering round the apertures. There were moments when sections of the Russian wall were genuinely at risk of being breached or pulled apart, and the defenders inside had to fight hand-to-hand in the narrow spaces between panels to prevent the Horde from tearing the fortress open from the outside. The battle was also consuming the Russian defenders. The Gulyay-gorod was a killing machine, but it was not impervious. Artillery fire from the Tatar and Ottoman guns had damaged sections of the wall, and the constant close-range combat was wearing down the garrison. Men were being killed and wounded behind the walls. Ammunition, both artillery powder and arquebus shot, was being consumed at a rate that raised the prospect of the fortress running dry before the Tatars ran out of men to throw at it. The defenders were hungry, thirsty from the summer heat and the exertions of sustained combat, and exhausted from days of constant alert and intermittent close combat. Chronicles record that conditions inside the Gulyay-gorod by the third and fourth day of the battle were grim in ways that went beyond the bodies piling up outside. The fighting reached a particularly savage intensity on and around August 2nd, 1572 AD, when Gulyay ordered what appears to have been his maximum effort assault, a coordinated attack by his largest available cavalry formations against the wooden walls, supported by artillery fire and the full weight of the Janissary infantry. The Khan had concluded that the stalemate could not continue indefinitely. His supply lines stretching back across the Oka were vulnerable. His cavalry horses were being fed from the surrounding countryside, but that resource was not unlimited. Every day he sat in front of the Gulyay-gorod without taking it was a day that allowed the Russian border patrols to consolidate, allowed reinforcements to potentially march from Moscow, and allowed the season to advance toward autumn, when steppe campaigning became more difficult. Gulyay-gorod needed to break the fortress or break the Russian will to defend it. He committed everything he had to the August 2nd assault. The chronicles describe the attack as the largest single assault action of the battle. Waves of cavalry and dismounted fighters throwing themselves at multiple sections of the Russian walls simultaneously, trying to overwhelm the defenders' ability to shift reserves to any single threatened point. The gun ports blazed continuously. Russian artillery fired at near maximum rate, the cannon barrels hot to the touch from sustained discharge. The bodies in front of the walls were now piled deep enough that attacking Tatars were climbing over them to reach the oak panels. Modern estimates of Tatar casualties for the full engagement vary significantly. Russian chronicles of the era, including Vorotynsky's own reports, claim figures in the range of 100,000 dead, numbers consistent with the medieval chronicle tradition of reporting enemy losses at near total annihilation levels and not to be taken literally. Modern Russian historians examining the demographic evidence from the Crimean Khanate in the years following 1572 AD have estimated the actual combat dead at something in the range of 15,000 to 27,000, killed on the battlefield and drowned in the Oka during the subsequent retreat, with an additional unknown number dying of wounds in the days following the battle. Modern scholarly estimates give figures of approximately 15,000 killed in battle and a further 12,000 drowned in the Oka River, for a total of around 27,000 dead. The loss of senior commanders was also disproportionately heavy. Members of Gulyay-gorod's own family, including a son and grandson, were among the casualties, giving the defeat a personal dimension that compounded its political impact. What those numbers do not fully convey is the qualitative nature of the loss. The men dying in front of the Gulyay-gorod were not conscripted peasant levies or poorly trained raiders. They were the core of the Crimean Khanate's military power, the experienced cavalry aristocracy, the professional warriors, the men on whose skill and confidence the entire edifice of Crimean military supremacy rested. Every noble bey who died charging those oak walls, every experienced cavalry officer whose horse fell under Russian cannon fire, every janissary who bled out in front of the gun ports, represented a loss that could not be quickly replaced. The Crimean Khanate was not a large population. It did not have an inexhaustible reservoir of military manpower. The losses at Molodi bit deep into the living body of a society that was already stretching its military capabilities to their limit. And then, on August 2nd, 1572 AD, something happened that changed the battle from a grinding siege into a decisive Russian counterattack. Vorotynsky waited until the Tatar assault had fully committed itself against the walls. He had tracked the cavalry reserves being fed into the assault. He had watched Gulyay-gorod pour his maximum force into the frontal attack. And now he decided the moment had come. He did not announce it with trumpets. He gathered a substantial force from within the Gulyay-gorod itself, the reserves he'd been hoarding through the days of defensive fighting, the men he'd been specifically holding back for this moment, and he slipped them out through the fortress's rear gates, away from the battle, into the woodland, around the Tatar flank, heading for the rear of Gulyay-gorod's attacking force. The trap was about to close. The trap had two jaws. Gulyay-gorod had seen only one of them. For days, the Khan had been watching his men throw themselves at the wooden walls of the Gulyay-gorod. He had seen his cavalry recoil from the gun ports. He had seen his janissaries bleed into the summer earth. He had seen his most capable general, D.V. Mirza, taken prisoner in the first hours of the battle, and he had responded the way experienced commanders respond to a stubborn defensive position, by escalating the pressure, bringing up more men, committing more reserves, grinding the defense down by sheer weight of numbers. He knew the Russian defenders inside the fortress were exhausted. He knew their ammunition was finite. He knew walls could be pulled apart. He just needed to keep pushing. What Gulyay-gorod had not been told, and what the chaos of the multi-day assault had concealed from him, was that Vorotynsky was no longer inside the Gulyay-gorod. The Russian Supreme Commander had slipped out of the fortress with a substantial portion of the army's cavalry reserve, moved them quietly through the woodland terrain flanking the battle area, and was now positioned in the Horde's rear. He had timed his exit from the fortress for the moment of maximum Tatar commitment to the frontal assault, the moment when Gulyay-gorod had committed his largest forces to the attack on the walls and had the least attention and the least cavalry free to screen his flanks and rear. This was the moment the entire Russian plan had been designed to create. everything that had happened since July 29th, 1572 AD. Every volley fired through the gun ports, every cavalry feint, every desperate hour of close combat at the walls had been building to this single operational opportunity. On August 2nd, 1572 AD, as the Tatar assault forces were at their maximum density against the Gulyay-gorod's walls, Vorotynsky struck. His cavalry formation emerged from the woodland at the rear of the Tatar assault force at full charge. Simultaneously, the gates of the Gulyay-gorod swung open, and Kvorostinin led the remaining Russian cavalry and infantry out of the fortress in a direct frontal counterattack, driving straight into the mass of Tatar warriors who had been pressing against the walls. The two Russian forces, one coming from the fortress front, one from the Horde's rear, converged on the Tatar assault formations from opposite directions simultaneously. The effect was devastating and near instantaneous. A cavalry force engaged in a frontal assault on a fixed position is in perhaps the most vulnerable tactical state it can occupy. Its horses are moving forward, its men are oriented toward the walls, its formation is compressed and bunched by the terrain channeling effects of the approach. It has no rear screen, it has no reserve position to meet an attack from behind. When Vorotynsky's cavalry hit the rear of Devlet-Giray's assault formations, those formations had no time, no space, and no organizational coherence to turn and respond. The men in the front ranks were still fighting toward the fortress walls. The men in the rear ranks were being cut down by Russian cavalry coming from behind. And then the gates opened, and Kvorostinin's men were among them from the front as well. Russian chronicles describe what followed as a rout. Not a gradual crumbling, not an ordered withdrawal under pressure, but a sudden collapse of the Tatar assault force's cohesion. Men who had been fighting with disciplined ferocity moments before were suddenly running, their formation gone, their commanders dead or cut off, no rallying point visible in any direction. The compressed terrain that had helped funnel them toward the Gulyay-gorod now worked against them. There was nowhere to go except back the way they had come, through the bodies of their own comrades, through the same ground the Russian cavalry was now driving across at full gallop. The fighting in this phase of the battle was savage and close. This was not the long-range controlled volley fire of the Gulyay-gorod's defensive phase. This was pursuit combat. Russian cavalry pressing the broken Tatar formations at close quarters, driving them back across the open ground, an enemy that had lost the ability to maneuver or reform. The Don Cossacks, who had been operating as the mobile screen of the Russian force throughout the campaign, now came into their own. Their knowledge of the terrain allowed them to cut ahead of the retreating Tatars, block escape routes, and drive portions of the fleeing force into killing grounds where they could be finished by the main cavalry force. Devlet-Giray understood within minutes that the battle was lost. The chronicles record that the Khan, who had ridden to the front to personally oversee the maximum effort assault on August 2nd, now found his guard cavalry fighting for their lives around him and the entire structure of his attack force disintegrating. He did the only thing a commander can do when a battle has turned catastrophically against him. He fled. He left his command tent on the battlefield. He left his personal standard, the great horsetail banner of the Crimean Khan, still standing in the earth where it had been planted. He gathered what remained of his personal escort and rode south as fast as his horse could carry him. Behind him, the greatest military force the Crimean Khanate had ever assembled was being driven from the field. The pursuit of the broken horde was relentless and extended over miles of ground. The Russian cavalry did not stop at the battlefield. They drove the fleeing Tatars south toward the Oka River, and the crossing of the Oka, that same river the horde had crossed so confidently just days before on their way north, became a catastrophe in its own right. Thousands of Tatar warriors who had survived the fighting at Molodi drowned in the Oka during the frantic retreat crossing. Men who could not find boats or fords plunged in on horseback or on foot and were swept away by the current or driven under by the press of numbers. Russian cavalry fire from the banks added to the carnage. Chronicles record that the river crossing became a scene of chaos and heavy loss. When the survivors finally staggered back across the steppe to Crimea, the scale of the disaster became apparent in its full dimension. Russian chronicles report, and this figure appears in multiple independent sources, that of the entire force that had crossed the Oka going north, only approximately 20,000 men made it back to the Crimean Peninsula. Even accounting for the chronicle tradition of exaggerating enemy losses and the variation in estimates of the original force size that represents a severe attrition rate, The dead included not just rank-and-file horsemen, but a disproportionate share of the Khanate's military and social elite. Devlet-Giray's own family had paid a heavy personal price. Members of his immediate family, including a son and grandson, were among the casualties. The senior commanders of the Nogai contingent had been killed or captured. The Ottoman Janissary detachment had been decimated. The demographic impact on the Crimean Khanate was severe and lasting. The Khanate was not a large population. The peninsula itself supported perhaps 200,000 to 400,000 people in total in the mid-16th century AD, and the military class that provided its cavalry was a relatively small fraction of that total. The loss of thousands of experienced warriors in a single campaign, on top of the losses of previous years of continuous raiding, represented a generational wound to Crimean military capacity. The Khans who succeeded Devlet-Giray would continue to raid Russia periodically throughout the following decades, but never again with the ambition or the scale of 1571 and 1572 AD. The dream of conquest, of a restored golden horde with a Crimean Khan, where the Mongol Great Khan had once sat, died in the fields south of Moscow in the summer of 1572 AD. Devlet-Giray himself, one of the most capable rulers the Crimean Khanate ever produced, survived the battle and continued to reign until his death in 1577 AD. But he never again launched a major invasion of Russia. His standing with the Ottoman Porte was badly damaged by the Molodi disaster. The Sultan's forces had supported this campaign with janissaries and artillery, and the result had been a humiliating failure. Ottoman strategic attention shifted elsewhere. The grand design of destroying the Tsardom of Muscovy and reimposing steppe domination over Russia was quietly shelved and never seriously revisited. After Molodi, the Crimean Khanate and its Ottoman suzerain never again mounted a comparable campaign aimed at conquering Muscovy. Prince Mikhail Ivanovich Vorotynsky, the man who had saved Russia, returned to Moscow having won what may have been the most consequential military victory in Russian history. Since the Great Stand on the Ugra River in 1480 AD ended the formal Tatar domination of Russia. He had outsmarted, outfought, and destroyed a force of staggering numerical superiority. He had done it with a smaller, exhausted, politically purged army, using a weapon system of his own devising, on terrain he had personally chosen. He had executed a combined arms battle plan of genuine operational sophistication, defence, feint, fixing action, and decisive counterattack that would not have looked out of place in the manuals of a 19th century AD staff college. Even the terrible rewarded him in the manner that had become characteristic of his reign. Within a year of Molodi, in 1573 AD, one of Vorotynsky's own household servants, facing punishment for theft, told the Tsar's investigators that his master had been practicing sorcery and plotting Ivan's death with magical charms. The accusation was almost certainly fabricated, possibly encouraged by Ivan's own paranoia, or by the intrigues of political enemies. Ivan, who never wanted for a pretext to destroy a man, ordered Vorotynsky subjected to torture. The man who had saved Russia from annihilation was placed between two bonfires, and, according to the hostile but influential memoirs of Prince Kurbsky, Ivan personally used a staff to rake the burning coals closer to Vorotynsky's body. The burns were fatal. Vorotynsky was transported to the Kirillo-Belozersky monastery and died on the way. He was buried there, in the monastery near his father's remains, without state honours, without a monument, and without the recognition that history owed him. Prince Dmitry Khavorostinin, whose cavalry had baited the trap and whose charge from the Gulyay-gorod's gates had sprung it, survived and continued to serve. He went on to fight in multiple subsequent campaigns, and was recognised in his time as one of Russia's most capable field commanders. But like Vorotynsky, his fame remained largely confined to Russia, and the battle that defined both their careers was slowly swallowed by the general obscurity that consumed the entire Molodi story. The Battle of Molodi was not forgotten immediately. Russian chronicles of the late 16th century AD recognised its importance clearly. The Novgorod Second Chronicle, the Moscow Chronicle, and Vorotynsky's own battle report all testify to a contemporary awareness that something extraordinary had happened south of Moscow in July and August of 1572 AD. But the political dynamics of Ivan the Terrible's court, the deliberate erasure of the Oprichnina, the execution of Vorotynsky, the general suppression of anything that might cast the Tsar's judgment and character in an unfavourable light, worked against the preservation of a clear public memory of the battle. A victory won by a general whom the Tsar subsequently tortured to death was not a victory that the Tsar had any strong interest in celebrating or commemorating. History has its own cruelties, and one of them is the tendency to remember the catastrophes rather than the salvations. The Mongol invasion of 1237 AD is remembered because it consumed Rus. The burning of Moscow in 1571 AD is remembered because it was a humiliation. The Battle of Molodi in 1572 AD, where Russia fought back, where the Gulyay-gorod held, where Vorotynsky's counterattack forced the Horde back and ended Gulyay-gorod's attempt to conquer Muscovy, is not remembered with anything approaching the recognition it deserves. For 5 days of fighting around a wooden fortress on the Lopasnia River, with everything at stake and almost nothing left to fight with, Russia survived. The steppe did not conquer Russia that summer, and every subsequent chapter of Russian history, the expansion into Siberia, the empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, the civilization that endured, rests in some meaningful sense on the foundation of what was decided at Molodi. The Gulyay-gorod was eventually phased out of Russian military use in the late 17th century AD. As the gunpowder revolution matured, European-style infantry tactics became dominant, and the nature of Russia's military frontier changed. But in 1572 AD, it was exactly the right weapon, in exactly the right place, operated by exactly the right men, and it performed its function with a terrible, mechanical completeness that Gulyay-gorod's invasion force never recovered from. The Horde was gone, Russia had survived, and 50 kilometers south of Moscow, in the late summer of 1572 AD, the birds were coming back to the trees along the Lopasnia River, settling among branches undisturbed now that the thunder of cannon and the screaming of cavalry charges had finally gone silent. The oak walls of the Gulyay-gorod still stood, scorched and arrow-pocked and stained by days of desperate fighting. Behind them, the men who had held those walls were still alive. That was everything. That was enough. The Battle of Molodi is one of the great forgotten turning points in Eastern European history. A nation at its most vulnerable, its army depleted by war and internal terror, its capital still scarred from the previous year's catastrophe. And yet it found within itself a commander of genius, a weapon of inspired engineering, and the human courage to stand and fight when every rational calculation said the cause was hopeless. Vorotynsky's victory did not just stop a raid. It ended the realistic possibility, in that era, that Gulyay-gorod's coalition would subjugate Muscovy. It gave a clear and lasting answer to the question that had shadowed Eastern Europe since the 13th century AD. Could the steppe powers reconquer and subjugate Russia? After Molodi, that ambition was no longer realistic. The man who made it happen died burned and broken, his name quietly buried by the same Tsar whose throne he had preserved. History's debt to Mikhail Vorotynsky has never been fully paid. Perhaps this video is one small installment on that debt. If it introduced you to a story you had never heard, if it made the past feel real and urgent and alive for even a few minutes, then this channel has done exactly what it exists to do. We will be back with more of these stories, the battles that changed everything, the names history forgot, the moments where the world nearly went a different way. If you want to be there when the next one drops, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. And if this video moved you, share it with one person who loves history. That single share does more for this channel than you might realise. One last thing before you go. If you want to support Wars in History directly and help us produce longer, deeper, more cinematic scripts like this one, consider joining the channel as a YouTube member. Membership starts at just $2.99 a month, less than a cup of coffee, and it goes directly into research, production, and keeping this channel alive. Members get early access to new videos, behind-the-scenes content, and the knowledge that they are personally part of keeping forgotten history from disappearing completely. The join button is right below the video. We would be honoured to have you. Thank you for watching. We will see you in the next battle.